Brooklyn, New York. The year was 1879, and the city was already bursting at the seams with poverty, crime, and children who had been discarded by the world. The cobblestone streets were alive with the sound of horses and carriages, yet in the cracks of that bustling city, you could hear something else, something far more unsettling. Behind the iron gates of certain forgotten buildings, children wept into the night, their voices muffled by stone walls that had heard too much. These were not schools. They were not homes. They were places where society locked away the unwanted, the abandoned, the broken. One such place stood in Brooklyn, a looming orphanage that carried with it a reputation even then. The brickwork was already blackened with soot, its windows too narrow for light to offer comfort. Parents who could not provide left their children there, sometimes with a final kiss, sometimes without a word. For the children inside, there was no laughter echoing down the corridors, only silence punctuated by the sharp sound of discipline, leather straps against skin, wooden canes meeting bone, the cries of the powerless. It was here that a small boy was brought, no older than 5. He was frail, pale, with a softness in his eyes that the world would soon strip away. His name was Hamilton Howard Fish, though in time the world would come to know him by another name. For now, he was simply one child among many, one more forgotten soul surrendered to an institution that did not nurture but devoured. The children said the orphanage was haunted, not by spirits in sheets, but by the weight of pain that clung to the walls like mildew. Each room had its stories, of a boy who never woke up after a beating, of a girl who disappeared after being taken to the cellar. And when the wind cut through the narrow hallways at night, it carried with it not comfort, but whispers. Whispers that seemed to know each child's darkest fear. For little Albert, the orphanage was not just a place of suffering. It was the birthplace of something far more sinister, something that would grow inside him for decades. As the gas lamps flickered outside on the streets of Brooklyn, few could have imagined that within these walls, a monster was being forged, not through choice, perhaps not even through nature, but through the cruelty of a place where innocence was stripped away, one child at a time. In the late 19th century, New York City was a place overflowing with children who had no one to claim them. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. Factories demanded cheap labor, families crumbled under poverty, and disease took parents faster than communities could recover. In Brooklyn, the solution was simple: build orphanages and fill them with the children no one else wanted. To the city's elite, these institutions were meant to be charitable havens, symbols of mercy. To the children who lived inside, they were anything but. The walls of these places were built to contain bodies, not to heal souls. They were overcrowded, understaffed, and often run by religious orders that believed pain was a pathway to salvation. Each day was rigidly scheduled, meals were thin, and punishments were plentiful. The smallest mistake, spilling food, speaking out of turn, or even wetting the bed, was met with swift retribution. The cane, the strap, the rod of discipline. These were the orphanage's true teachers. Children lived in long dormitories with rows of iron beds, their blankets too thin to keep out the New York winters. Illness spread quickly in these tight quarters, but medical care was scarce. To the outside world, these buildings were houses of God, places where the abandoned might find salvation. Inside, however, they were factories of suffering, an endless cycle of hunger, fear, and pain. There were whispers even then that orphanages were less about protection and more about control. Some were accused of exploiting children as unpaid labor, sending them to work in kitchens, laundries, and fields. Others were said to have darker secrets, children who disappeared without explanation, records that were quietly erased. Yet the city ignored these stories, for orphanages solved a problem few wished to see. The streets looked cleaner, and society could turn its eyes away from the thousands of children suffering just beyond those locked doors. It was into this world that young Albert Fish was thrown. A fragile boy with no family to shield him, he was swallowed whole by an institution that cared little for his survival, and even less for his soul. Every crack in the brickwork, every echo of the cane striking flesh would leave its mark upon him. And while other children broke under the weight of cruelty, Albert learned something different. He began to watch, he began to feel, and within the forgotten walls of a Brooklyn orphanage, his story, the story of a monster in the making, quietly began. His birth name was Hamilton Howard Fish. To his family, he was simply Albert, a name borrowed from a dead sibling, as if his existence began under the shadow of loss. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, he was the youngest of 4 children in a family already teetering on the edge of collapse. His father, a man old enough to be his grandfather, died when Albert was still a boy. His mother, left alone and penniless, could not care for him. Poverty forced her hand, and so Albert was delivered to an orphanage in Brooklyn, a place where he would remain for several of the most formative years of his childhood. To the caretakers, he was just another mouth to feed, another fragile body to cram into the long rows of beds. To the other children, he was a quiet boy, one who kept his eyes lowered and his words few. He had no strength to fight back, no family to rescue him, no safety net. He was a child already marked by tragedy, and the institution swallowed him without pause. Albert was small for his age, thin and pale, with a softness that made him an easy target. The other boys learned to adapt, hardening themselves against the abuse that came daily. Albert, however, absorbed it differently. Every slap across the face, every lash of the cane, left not only bruises but also a strange impression deep inside him. He did not cry out as much as the others. He watched, he felt, and sometimes when the sting of punishment lingered on his skin, a part of him began to twist the pain into something else entirely. The orphanage was merciless, and the children inside were often cruel to one another. Albert's softness set him apart, but it was within these walls that his identity began to fracture. The punishments became routine, the fear constant, the silence suffocating. He would later confess that it was here, among these narrow beds and echoing corridors, that his fascination with pain first took root. But at the time, no one saw him as anything more than another lost child. In photographs of the era, orphanage children appear hollow-eyed, their faces prematurely aged by sorrow. Imagine Albert among them, a boy barely 5 years old, clutching the edges of a blanket too thin to keep him warm, listening to the cries of other children in the night. He did not yet know the name the world would one day give him. He was not yet the gray man, nor the Brooklyn vampire. He was only Albert, small, forgotten, and already being shaped into something the world would come to fear. The orphanage in Brooklyn was not a place of nurture, but of discipline. Its halls rang not with laughter, but with the sharp crack of leather straps and the gasps of children learning what it meant to be powerless. The caretakers believed pain was a tool, a lesson in obedience. They wielded it freely. A child who spoke out of turn might find himself on his knees, beaten until his skin turned purple. A boy who wet the bed was forced to parade through the dormitories, mocked by the very people entrusted with his care, and always the cane waited, its wooden shaft whispering promises of correction that left scars not only on the flesh, but deep within the mind. Albert, frail and quiet, became a frequent target. His small frame, his hesitant nature, seemed to draw punishment. He was struck for minor infractions, for accidents, for silence that was mistaken as disobedience. At night, when he lay in his narrow bed, the bruises still hot on his skin, he listened to the muffled cries of other children enduring the same fate. It was a symphony of suffering, a chorus that never ceased. There were darker whispers, too, rumors among the children of caretakers who lingered too long by their bedsides, of punishments that went beyond beatings. Secrets exchanged in hushed tones, stories of boys who returned from the cellar with eyes that would never again meet another's. The walls themselves seemed to hold these confessions, every stone soaked with sorrow. And yet, the city beyond those walls remained blind. The orphanage was a solution, not a scandal. The cries of abandoned children did not reach the carriages rattling down Brooklyn's streets. For Albert, something strange began to happen. The punishments that should have broken him instead began to take on another meaning. He admitted, years later, that the pain became something he learned to crave. Where another child might flinch at the strap, Albert felt a dark thrill, a strange comfort in the sting of the cane. He began to blur the line between fear and desire, between punishment and pleasure. What the orphanage sought to beat out of him, it instead drove deeper into his soul. By the time Albert was old enough to remember, the orphanage had already done its work. The sounds of children being beaten, the cries that echoed through the dormitories, became the backdrop of his earliest memories. The orphanage did not just discipline him, it rewired him. It planted seeds that would grow in twisted directions, until the boy who once trembled under the strap would one day become the man who inflicted horrors far beyond what any of those walls had ever contained. For most children in the Brooklyn orphanage, the beatings were a nightmare that lived in their bones. The sound of the strap sliding from a caretaker's belt, the weight of the cane slamming down on flesh. These were moments to fear, to dread, to survive. But for Albert, something different was happening. He would later admit, almost with pride, that the orphanage had taught him to love what he should have hated. Pain was not punishment for him anymore. It was fascination. It was discovery. He began to play games in his mind during the punishments, testing how long he could endure, how deeply he could sink into the sting without letting a cry escape. Sometimes he even welcomed the strikes. The sharp bite of leather or wood across his skin gave him something he could not find elsewhere. A sense of focus, a strange form of control in a world where he had none. The more he was beaten, the more the lines blurred. Fear became anticipation. Anticipation became desire. The other children noticed. Some whispered about the strange boy who did not cry the way they did, who sometimes seemed almost eager when punishment was handed out. In a place where suffering was meant to bend and break, Albert was bending in another direction entirely. He was twisting, reshaping, turning cruelty into fuel. The orphanage, without knowing it, was not correcting him. It was creating something that had never existed before. At night, Albert's games continued. Alone in his narrow bed, he replayed the punishments in his mind. The sound of leather snapping against skin echoed like a lullaby. The pain clung to him, mingling with his thoughts until it was no longer separate from who he was. He began to imagine new ways to feel it, new ways to chase it. The orphanage had planted a seed of obsession, and Albert watered it with every lash, every bruise, every night of silent trembling that ended not in fear, but in a grim kind of pleasure. These were the years that forged him, though no one could see it at the time. To the caretakers, he was just another boy, one more body to discipline. To the city, he was invisible. But in the silence of those dark dormitories, Albert Fish was beginning to invent a new relationship with suffering. What others endured and escaped, he embraced. And it was here, in the orphanage's hidden corners, that the games began. Games that would one day spill into the world beyond Brooklyn, leaving a trail of horror no punishment could erase. There was something about the Brooklyn orphanage that lingered with those who passed through its gates, as if the very walls had absorbed the cries of the children and refused to let them go. The building itself was heavy with gloom. Its windows were too narrow, its corridors too long, and its ceiling so high that every sound echoed endlessly. Even when the halls were quiet, there was the sense that someone, or something, was listening. The children whispered about it among themselves. They spoke of cold spots that followed them as they moved through the dormitories, of shadows that shifted even when no one was there. Some said that at night they could hear the voices of children who had already died in those beds, calling out their names. Others swore that the cellar was cursed, that once a boy was dragged below the stairs, he never came back the same. These weren't simply childish fears. In a place where suffering was constant, it was easy to believe that the air itself had grown poisoned, that the building was more than brick and mortar. It was alive with the weight of cruelty. The caretakers dismissed these stories, calling them the inventions of young minds. But there were things even they could not deny. Children who vanished from the rolls without explanation, sudden illnesses that swept through the dormitories, claiming lives in silence, accidents that seemed too frequent, too deliberate. The walls of the orphanage became a kind of prison, and once you entered, you were bound not only by the iron gates, but by the shadows themselves. For Albert, the building was more than a home. It was a tomb that still breathed, a haunted place where suffering was constant and escape impossible. The echoes of beatings carried down the hallways long after they had ended, and the flickering of the gas lamps at night cast shapes that seemed to leer from the plaster. Even the church services, with their hymns and sermons, felt hollow, as if God himself had abandoned this place. Years later, Albert would remember the orphanage not just as a site of pain, but as a place steeped in dread. The institution had no ghosts in white sheets, no rattling chains or apparitions. Its haunting came from the children themselves, from their broken bodies, their silenced voices, their eyes that grew too old too quickly. The Brooklyn Orphanage was haunted not by the dead, but by the living, and Albert was one of them. Albert was not the only child swallowed by the Brooklyn Orphanage. Behind those iron gates, hundreds passed through, their lives reduced to files in dusty ledgers, their childhoods dissolved into the silence of the institution. Few names survived, but their stories lived in whispers, the kind only children dared to share when the caretakers were out of earshot. There was the boy called Samuel, older than Albert by a few years, who had once been full of energy when he first arrived. Within months, he had grown thin and hollow-eyed. The other children claimed they had seen him dragged to the cellar after wetting his bed. When he returned, he did not speak anymore. His silence was so complete it unnerved even the caretakers. One morning, Samuel was gone. The officials claimed he had been transferred to another facility. The children knew better. They said the cellar had taken him, and that at night you could still hear the sound of him crying beneath the floorboards. There was Mary, a girl of 9 with golden hair who, for a time, comforted the younger ones when the punishments grew too harsh. She had a voice that could quiet even the restless at night. But then, she too disappeared. A caretaker said she had been adopted by a wealthy family in the city, yet no one ever saw her again. The other children said they heard her name being whispered in the chapel long after she was gone, as though the walls themselves remembered her better than the world outside. And there were dozens of others, children who bore scars across their backs, who flinched at the sound of footsteps, who lay awake at night staring into the darkness, afraid to sleep because they knew they might be woken by pain. Some broke quietly, folding into themselves until they were shadows of who they had been. Others lashed out, their anger misdirected at the only people weaker than them, their fellow orphans. In the end, everyone learned to adapt or to vanish. Albert watched all of this. He saw boys disappear, girls reduced to silence, spirits crushed until nothing human remained. And while the cruelty bent most of the children into submission, it twisted Albert into something else entirely. Where others became numb, he became fascinated. Where others trembled, he leaned closer. In the silent suffering of the other orphans, Albert found confirmation of what he was already beginning to understand, that pain had power, and that those who endured it could either break or be remade into something altogether darker. Beyond the high walls of the orphanage, life in Brooklyn carried on as if nothing were wrong. The streets were loud with horse-drawn carts, shopkeepers calling out their wares, and families hurrying to and fro with no thought to the children hidden away just blocks from their homes. To the city, the orphanage was a charitable institution, a solution to the problem of poverty and abandonment. The newspapers rarely mentioned what happened inside those walls. And when they did, it was always in glowing terms. How many children had been saved? How much good work was being done in the name of faith and community? No one wanted to see the truth. The cries of children never made it past the brick barriers. The bruises faded before adoption visits. The stories of abuse and neglect never reached the public because they weren't meant to. Society had chosen its comfort over its conscience. It was easier to believe the orphans were being cared for than to acknowledge they were being broken. In that silence, monsters could grow. Not only the caretakers whose hands carried out the punishments, but also the children themselves. Some of them hardened into bullies, repeating the cruelty they endured. Others were crushed, their spirits extinguished before they had the chance to grow. And then there was Albert. For Albert, the orphanage was not just a cage, but a classroom. Every beating became a lesson, every punishment an experiment in endurance. The silence of the city outside allowed his obsession to flourish unchecked. He began to wait for punishments, even seek them. While other children tried desperately to avoid the strap, Albert found himself imagining it, craving it. He admitted later that it was here, within these walls, that he first discovered the link between pain and desire, between cruelty and comfort. At night, lying awake in his narrow bed, he would replay the events of the day in his mind. The sting of the cane, the humiliation of being singled out, the trembling of his own body under the watchful eye of his punishers. These things should have filled him with shame. Instead, they began to fill him with something disturbingly close to joy. The other children whispered about ghosts in the halls. Albert discovered a different haunting, the realization that he wanted what others feared. The city remained blind, proud of its institutions, pleased to have its streets free of abandoned children. But inside the orphanage, a boy was being shaped by suffering in a way no one could have imagined. While society turned away, Albert Fish turned inward, constructing a world where pain and pleasure intertwined. The silence outside allowed his darkness to grow, unchallenged, until it became inseparable from who he was. Albert was a lonely child, though loneliness in the orphanage was not unique. Each boy and girl there carried a hollow space where family should have been, and yet Albert's isolation was different. Even among the abandoned, he stood apart. The other children found fragments of comfort with each other, shared food, whispered secrets, fleeting moments of laughter stolen in the courtyard. But Albert struggled to connect. He spoke little, his pale eyes rarely meeting another's, his silence too deep to be bridged. When he was punished, he accepted it quietly, and when others reached for him, he seemed to drift further away, locked inside a private world only he could see. In that inner world, Albert began to shape his own strange rituals. He replayed the beatings like stories, holding on to every detail. He turned his bruises into reminders, tracing them at night with small fingers as though they were trophies instead of wounds. Sometimes he would imagine a world where pain was not inflicted in anger but given freely, a twisted form of affection. It was a place he could retreat to when the orphanage felt too suffocating. And so his loneliness deepened, not just because he lacked family or friends, but because even in a room full of suffering children, Albert's mind was wandering somewhere darker, somewhere none of them could follow. Beyond the gates, Brooklyn was no gentler. The city at the end of the 19th century was a place of shadows, especially for the poor. The streets were choked with smoke from factories, the alleys filled with beggars, and crime lurked at every corner. Children who escaped the orphanage often found themselves in worse conditions, begging for scraps, sleeping under bridges, or falling into the hands of criminals who promised shelter in exchange for servitude. Brooklyn was not a place that nurtured children. It devoured them. Albert would sometimes glimpse this world when taken out on errands or walks, clutching the hand of a caretaker who dragged him along. The streets teemed with noise and life, but to Albert, they were cold and hostile. The faces of strangers were hard, their eyes indifferent. The city did not see him as a child. It did not see him at all. In a sense, the orphanage and Brooklyn were mirrors of each other, both places that thrived on silence, on the disappearance of children into systems that did not care whether they survived, so long as they stayed invisible. And in that darkness, Albert learned something crucial. There was no refuge, not in the dormitories, not in the chapel, not even in the wide streets beyond the orphanage gates. He was alone everywhere, and in that isolation, he turned to the only constant he had ever known: pain. Loneliness did not make him fragile. It made him inventive. It drove him further into the private obsessions growing in his mind, obsessions that would one day erupt into horrors that the city, so eager to ignore him as a child, could never again look away from. Religion was everywhere in the orphanage. It hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating, wrapping itself around every moment of the children's lives. The chapel bell rang before dawn, dragging them from their narrow beds into cold pews where their small bodies shivered in silence. The caretakers spoke of salvation, of sin, of the punishment that awaited the wicked in hell. For children who had already lost everything, the words were terrifying. To them, God was not a savior, but another overseer, invisible yet watching, ready to condemn them for the smallest misstep. Albert learned quickly that the language of faith was not about comfort. It was about control. Hymns were sung not with joy, but with trembling voices, the words repeated like incantations that few understood. The priests and caretakers claimed that beatings were not cruelty but correction, that through suffering, a child's soul could be cleansed. Each lash of the cane was framed as God's will, a lesson in obedience meant to drive sin out of fragile bodies. To resist was not only to defy the orphanage, but to defy the Almighty himself. For Albert, the sermons left a mark far deeper than the bruises on his skin. They taught him that pain was not random. It was divine, that the sting of leather and the taste of blood were part of something holy. These lessons blurred the lines between morality and punishment, between cruelty and love. He began to see pain as sacred, a strange communion between flesh and spirit. And while the other children cowered in fear of eternal damnation, Albert absorbed these teachings with a disturbing clarity. But the true damage was not visible to the eye. The physical wounds healed, fading from purple to yellow, then disappearing altogether. The invisible ones lingered. They took shape in Albert's thoughts, twisting his understanding of affection, corrupting his sense of trust. Yet, where most children sought comfort in touch, Albert grew to associate touch with pain. Where others prayed for safety, Albert prayed for something else entirely, an intimacy bound not by kindness, but by suffering. He carried these invisible scars with him long after leaving the orphanage. They were not like broken bones that could knit themselves back together. They were fractures in the mind, cracks in the soul, distortions of how a child learns to love and be loved. The orphanage had turned religion into a weapon, and in doing so, it carved Albert into something unrecognizable. To the world, he was still just another boy, one of many forgotten orphans. But inside, he was already beginning to carry the shadow of a man who would confuse cruelty with compassion and violence with intimacy. These wounds never closed. They remained open, festering, shaping every choice he would make in the years to come. And though the chapel bell rang to signal the end of each service, for Albert, its echoes never stopped. It was as if the voice of the orphanage, harsh, holy, and cruel, followed him everywhere, whispering that pain was sacred, that suffering was love, and that he was destined to carry those truths into the darkest corners of his future. The orphanage thrived on silence. It was not just the silence of the children, but of the city, of the system itself. Every cry that echoed in the dormitories was smothered before it could reach the outside world. Complaints were buried under paperwork. Deaths were explained away as illnesses. Transfers erased children from the rolls without so much as a raised eyebrow. The caretakers relied on silence as their greatest weapon, for it was silence that allowed them to continue. If a child spoke up, the punishments grew worse. If a parent questioned too loudly, they were told their child was ungrateful or troubled. The church blessed the orphanage as a place of charity, while the city officials praised it for solving the problem of abandoned youth. Silence was everywhere, and in its stillness, cruelty thrived. It was a system designed not to protect children, but to erase them, to remove them from sight and thought until their suffering no longer mattered. For Albert, that silence became part of him. He stopped speaking as much, stopped trying to connect with those around him. Each day, he seemed to retreat further into himself, his presence fading into the background. Teachers forgot he was in the room. Other children overlooked him, except when it was time to mock or punish. He became less like a boy and more like a shadow, drifting through the orphanage unnoticed. At times, it was as if he was testing what it felt like to disappear, to hold his breath, to move without sound, to slip past the gaze of those who sought to control him. There was power in being unseen. While the other children fought to be heard or to cling to scraps of affection, Albert began to find comfort in the opposite. He allowed himself to dissolve into the silence, to become a ghost within the very walls that sought to contain him. This invisibility only deepened his obsessions. Unseen, He could indulge his private rituals, tracing his scars, reliving his punishments, constructing fantasies that no one else would ever know. While the caretakers beat the children into submission, Albert welcomed the anonymity. If no one noticed him, no one could stop what was happening in his mind. The boy that had once been small and fragile was fading, replaced by something harder to define. He was no longer simply an orphan in Brooklyn. He was a shadow of himself, shaped by silence and sharpened by loneliness. A ghost that walked among the living, already beginning to carry the weight of horrors that had yet to be unleashed. The orphanage had set out to discipline him, to strip him of sin and obedience. Instead, it had erased the boy and left behind something far more dangerous, a presence that thrived in the quiet, a ghost who learned to live in darkness. Albert Fish was not yet the monster history would remember, but in those silent corridors, he was already becoming less human, already vanishing into something else entirely. Eventually, Albert left the orphanage. His mother, having regained some measure of stability, was able to reclaim him. To the officials, it was the success story the system liked to tell. A child taken in, disciplined, and finally returned to his family. On paper, it was proof that the institution worked. In reality, Albert did not walk out of those gates as the same boy who had entered. The damage had already been done. He stepped back into the world carrying scars that no one could see. His mother welcomed him, but she could not understand what had been carved into him during those years. To her, he was simply quiet, withdrawn, a little strange. To Albert, the orphanage was not something he had escaped. It was something he carried with him, a weight that clung to every thought. The lessons he had learned within those walls, the mingling of pain and desire, the sanctity of suffering, the comfort of silence, were etched too deeply to be undone. Brooklyn, meanwhile, was no gentler than the orphanage. The city was growing rapidly, its streets crowded with immigrants, laborers, and the desperate poor. Crime and corruption flourished in its alleys. Children wandered in gangs, begging or stealing to survive. The tenements were suffocating, stacked high with families who had nothing but each other. The city officials turned a blind eye, just as they had to the abuses of the orphanage. To live in Brooklyn was to understand hunger, fear, and neglect. For Albert, these streets were both terrifying and intoxicating. The city seemed alive with shadows, and he gravitated toward them. The alleys, the doorways, the corners where the gaslight faded into darkness, all of it called to him. In the orphanage, he had learned to endure. In Brooklyn, he learned to disappear. He slipped easily into the anonymity of the city, where no one cared who you were so long as you stayed out of sight. But inside him, the obsessions were growing louder. The pain he once endured in the orphanage became something he sought out in secret. He began experimenting with his own body, finding new ways to recreate the sting he craved. The city offered endless opportunity, tools, privacy, the ability to vanish into its chaos. While the other boys his age were chasing work or play, Albert was chasing something darker. The shadows of Brooklyn embraced him. They offered freedom, but also temptation. The city was filled with children just like him, lonely, abandoned, invisible. And Albert, molded by years of silence and cruelty, began to see them not as companions, but as reflections. Each one reminded him of the orphanage, of the punishments, of the power hidden in suffering. The walls of the institution had released him, but the city had become its extension, a larger orphanage without gates, where silence and shadows reigned. Albert was no longer confined, but freedom did not save him. It only gave him space to grow into what the orphanage had already made of him. The boy who had once been a ghost behind stone walls was now drifting through the streets of Brooklyn, unseen, carrying with him the seeds of horrors that would one day explode into history. Freedom did not mean salvation for Albert Fish. If anything, it gave his obsessions room to grow. The lessons of the orphanage clung to him like a second skin, and though he was no longer under the constant watch of caretakers, their punishments lived on inside his mind. At night, in the cramped rooms of his mother's home, he found himself longing for the sting of the cane, the sharp discipline that had once terrified him. The absence of it left a void, a craving that gnawed at him until he sought ways to recreate it on his own. It began innocently, or at least it might have appeared so. Albert would pinch his skin until it bruised, or press his body against rough surfaces to feel the scrape and burn. But soon, the small torments were not enough. He experimented with needles, with sharp objects, with anything that could replicate the sensation of punishment. These secret acts became his rituals, hidden from his family, concealed beneath the mask of a quiet boy. To them, Albert was odd, but harmless. To Albert, he was awakening something he could not explain, something he could not stop. The fantasies followed soon after. His mind, shaped by years of cruelty, began to twist pain into stories. He imagined scenes where he was punished again, beaten not out of anger, but out of care, as though suffering was the purest form of intimacy. Sometimes he imagined inflicting the punishments himself, turning the role of victim into that of master. The lines blurred until even he no longer knew whether he longed to feel the pain or to give it. These fantasies grew darker as the years passed. They were not fleeting thoughts, but vivid daydreams that consumed him, intruding into his daily life. While other children his age were dreaming of play, of work, of futures brighter than their present, Albert's inner world was filled with visions of leather straps, sharpened tools, and trembling bodies. He replayed the orphanage not as trauma, but as memory to be savored, a foundation upon which he could build his secret desires. The seeds of obsession had been planted long ago, but now they were beginning to take root. The boy who had once been broken by the orphanage was constructing an entirely new world inside himself, a place where pain and desire were indistinguishable, where suffering was not an end, but a beginning. In time, this inner world would spill outward, shaping the choices he made, the acts he committed, the horrors he would one day unleash. Albert Fish was no longer just haunted by what had been done to him. He was beginning to haunt himself, weaving his own rituals, feeding his own shadows. The fantasies offered him comfort, but also control. And once he discovered the power of that control in his imagination, it was only a matter of time before he sought it in the world beyond his mind. As Albert grew older, he learned the art of disguise. Outwardly, he was a quiet, obedient boy, the kind of child who drew little attention. He spoke when spoken to, performed his chores without complaint, and never caused the kind of trouble that made neighbors whisper. To those who knew him, he was simply reserved, perhaps fragile, a boy shaped by hardship but harmless all the same. It was a mask, and Albert wore it well. But behind that mask, another life was forming. The boy who had once been beaten into silence now lived in a world of secrets. He carried with him the rituals he had begun in childhood, turning pain onto private games. At night, when the house was still, he would slip into his obsessions, finding ways to revisit the punishments he craved. He began collecting objects that others would never think twice about, needles, scraps of leather, small blades, and hiding them away like treasures. Each one was a tool, a reminder, a piece of the world he kept hidden from everyone else. It was in this hidden life that whispers of violence began to emerge. At first, they were fleeting thoughts, shadows in the corner of his mind. He would see a child on the street, hungry and alone, and instead of pity, he felt a strange pull. He imagined what it might be like to control them the way the caretakers had controlled him, to punish, to test, to see how much suffering they could endure. These thoughts disturbed him, but they also thrilled him. The line between victim and tormentor was fading, and in the darkness of his fantasies, Albert sometimes stepped into both roles at once. The whispers grew louder with time. They came unbidden, creeping into his mind during the simplest of tasks. While walking through the crowded Brooklyn streets, he would imagine the cries of children beneath the rumble of carriage wheels. While sitting quietly at dinner, he would recall the sting of the strap, not with dread, but with longing. The world around him became a stage upon which his imagination replayed its twisted dramas. No one suspected. To his mother, Albert remained her quiet son. To neighbors, he was a boy touched by hardship, but no different from the many others in the city. Yet beneath the surface, the double life was taking hold. One part of him moved through the world unnoticed, while the other grew darker, more insistent, whispering of cruelties that had not yet escaped his imagination, but soon would. Albert Fish was learning the most dangerous lesson of all, that he could exist in both lives at once, that he could smile with his family by day and feed his obsessions by night, that the world would not see what he carried inside so long as he kept his silence. The double life had begun, and with it, the whispers of violence that would one day drown out everything else. Though Albert had walked out of the orphanage years earlier, he never truly left it behind. The walls, the shadows, the punishments, they stayed with him, etched into his mind so deeply that they followed him wherever he went. He carried the orphanage like a ghost inside him. When he closed his eyes, he still saw the narrow beds lined up in rows. He still heard the chapel bell tolling in the morning. He still felt the sting of the cane across his skin, a sensation that no passing of time could erase. The world outside might have moved on, but Albert remained bound to that place, as though its chains had never been unlocked. The lessons he learned there colored everything. Silence became his shield. Loneliness became his companion. Pain became his language. These were not things he outgrew. They were things that defined him. Each time he inflicted small torments on himself, he was reliving those early years. Each time he indulged his secret fantasies, he was replaying the rituals taught to him within those walls. The orphanage had not corrected him. It had created him. Its cruelty was not a memory, but a foundation. And Albert was building his life upon it. And as he drifted through the streets of Brooklyn, he realized he was not the only one shaped by abandonment. The city was full of forgotten children, boys huddled in alleys, shoeless and hungry, girls no older than 10 begging on corners, their hands trembling as strangers passed them by. Orphans filled the factories, their small bodies working machines meant for grown men. Some lived in gangs, surviving through theft and scraps. Others simply disappeared, swallowed by the city's darkness, their names never recorded, their absence never questioned. Albert saw himself in them. Each child was a reflection of his own past, lonely, invisible, disposable. He watched them with a fascination that blurred the line between empathy and obsession. To most people, these children were a problem to be ignored, a reminder of poverty best left unspoken. But to Albert, they were something more. They were both mirror and temptation, proof that he was not alone in his suffering, and yet also fuel for the fantasies that were beginning to consume him. The city did nothing for them, just as it had done nothing for him. Brooklyn's forgotten children moved like ghosts through the streets, unacknowledged by the world, carrying scars no one wanted to see. Albert walked among them as one of their own, but unlike the rest, he carried within him something darker. The orphanage had planted its cruelty in him, and now, surrounded by the abandoned, he felt its echo stronger than ever. In many ways, Albert never left the orphanage because the orphanage was everywhere. In the shadows of Brooklyn, in the hollow eyes of starving children, in the silence of a city that refused to care. It was all around him, feeding his obsession, reminding him that suffering was endless, and that he could never escape the lessons he had been forced to learn. In the end, Albert Fish's childhood was not just a story of poverty or abandonment. It was the story of how an institution, built in the name of charity, forged a monster in silence. The orphanage was meant to save him, but instead it hollowed him out, replacing love with cruelty, affection with pain, faith with fear. Every lash of the cane, every sermon twisted into punishment, every cry swallowed by the silence of those stone walls planted the seeds of the man he would become. Albert himself would later admit that the orphanage shaped his desires. The punishments that broke other children bent him in another direction. He learned to welcome pain, to hunger for it, to see in it a kind of intimacy that no kindness could ever provide. What should have been scars became cravings, and what should have been trauma became obsession. By the time he left, he was no longer a boy searching for comfort. He was a boy who had found comfort in cruelty. The tragedy of Albert's story is not just that he became a killer, but that he was shaped to become one long before his crimes ever began. The city ignored him, just as it ignored countless other children. The orphanage devoured him, just as it devoured countless others. But unlike them, Albert carried his suffering forward, turning it into something the world could no longer ignore. The monster the newspapers would one day describe was not born in isolation. It was built, brick by brick, inside the very institution meant to protect him. His legacy is a shadow cast not only by his own horrors, but by the society that allowed him to exist. Brooklyn's forgotten children continued to vanish into poverty, into crime, into graves that bore no names. The system carried on, cloaked in silence, long after Albert had left its walls. And in that silence, it left behind a question far more haunting than Albert Fish himself. How many others were, shaped in the same way, twisted in the same silence, broken into forms the world would never see until it was too late? Albert Fish became infamous, remembered as one of America's most grotesque killers. But behind the legend of the gray man, the boogeyman, lay the truth of a child shaped by cruelty and neglect. His story is not only a warning of what one man became, but of what silence can create. The orphanage never closed its doors. It lived on in him and through him, in the terror he inflicted on others. And so the legacy of Albert Fish is not just the murders, not just the horror of his crimes, but the reminder that monsters are not always born, they are made. And sometimes they are made in places society praises, in institutions hidden in plain sight where silence is the loudest sound of all.